My husband, Volodya Padunov, and I were living in the Soviet Union for several years. And we fell in with a group of people. I think it was Aksionov who initially introduced us or sent us to, knowing we were going, he gave us some names and addresses. And we ended up spending quite a bit of time with a group of people who tended to collect at Viktor Yerofeyev's apartment. It was centrally located. He was a wonderful host, and he had a bunch of really interesting friends. And so it was the kind of classic gathering was Viktor and his wife, Vesna, and Sorokin, Zhenya Popov, and Dmitry Alexandrovich. Sometimes his wife Sveta was there. Very interesting group of people. Loosely associated also were Tanya Sherbina, Misha Yampolsky, Misha Epstein, but the kind of core group that would get together and drink beer, eat shrimp, and read poetry or whatever, read stories aloud to each other, was Zhenya Popov, Viktor Yerofeyev, and Sorokin, and Dmitry Alexandrovich. And, we would spend the evenings together, drinking, laughing, reading poetry, doing things that one tended to do in the mid-'80s. There always seemed back then to be so much time, so much more time than there is now. And this was the period when he was writing, it's always a word that I mix up. Предуведомление, very hard to pronounce. Предуведомление, and also Обращение, and also his Милиционер и толпа collection, and Stikogrammy. He was writing Stikogrammy, I remember then. I think that if you look at his work, you'll find that that corresponds with his history. He wore his militia hat quite often, whether he was reciting or not. And he was, I suppose, among the most generous people of that group that I knew, not only in the sense, like Viktor Yerofeyev, he was a good host, but in the sense that you could talk with him about anything. Normally, if you speak to writers, in my experience at that time, but also even today, if you speak to Russian writers, they want you to speak to them about their work, and they become impatient very quickly if you speak to them about somebody else's work. It's a kind of a narcissistic move, perhaps, but you have to keep it very narrowly focused on their work and how much you don't or do or whatever, like that, how you understand their work. Dmitry Alexandrovich was completely different. You could speak to him about anything. You could have debates about postmodernism. You could discuss the different intricacies of Sots art, the relationship of Sots art historically to conceptualism. He had endless time and patience to argue back and forth with you like a regular university colleague. So he was both an artist, a visual artist and a poet, but he was also, if not a scholar, then an analyst. He was an analyst, and he loved to talk reflexively about the movement that he was part of. And I noticed that recently Boris Groys, in his Выставка, in his exhibit, Spectres of Communism, talks about a high degree of reflexivity in conceptualist work, not only visually on the canvas or literarily in the published texts, but also that the conceptualists were marked by a tendency to be able to speak very explicitly about the theories of their work, so the strategies, in ways that were very calm and straightforward, and not, I suppose, hidden or neurotic or self-concealing. And for that reason, of all of them, Dmitry Alexandrovich was the most patient and the most generous. He just adored intellectual conversations and didn't mind a bit. And if you wanted to talk about Ulitskaya, you wanted to talk about Petrushevskaya, you wanted to talk about any number of other writers, he was delighted to do that with you without a trace of jealousy or a sense that it had to be about him at all. He was an extraordinarily generous person. And of course, he was an actor as well. If you follow his work, you remember him from Taxi Blues in 90, I guess 1990, yeah, 1990, and Krustalov Mashinu in 1998. So he was a cult figure, but he was a cult figure in the sense that everybody liked him. Everybody liked him. He was a very, very generous conversations with him. He had all in the world to debate ideas with you. So, what else can I say about him? Another thing that I really liked about him, for me, if one talks about conceptualism generally and different substrata within conceptualism, and working from the assumption that there is a distinction between conceptualism and socialism, and each of us will explain it differently. For me, conceptualism is a much broader, generic category within which there's a much narrower subcategory called sotsart. For me, Dmitry Alexandrovich, what I treasured the most was when he was able to reach that space in conceptualism where it was absolutely unclear whether he was kidding or not. It was so sincere and so heartfelt and so Philistine, so middle class, so tender, and yet the terror was just, the terror of Stalinism or the KGB. It was just her. It reminded me of for example, Erich Bulatov's Soviet Cosmos, 1977, or Bulatov's Krasikov Street, also 1977, in which you're either looking at socialist realism or you're looking at the biggest spoof you have ever seen in your life. And you can't tell beyond a certain point. It was so close to the edge that it could pass for serious. And Dmitry Alexandrovich at his best was that serious, sweet, but the kind of sweetness when you see a painting of Stalin with a child on his lap, that kind of sweetness, brutal, sentimental, sweet, and the kind of flickering between terror and gentility that I think Dmitry Alexandrovich had a very keen sense of how to sustain. That's what for me, he did most delightfully and his best contribution to conceptualism. That's what I valued most about him. Let me see, what else do I remember from that period? When we were getting to know him, Volodya and I, he was just in the process of going up on the street and gluing little poems to street lamps. Little poems, or handing them out to people. I think he got arrested shortly after that. We were away on a trip, so I don't know what exactly happened, but he was telling us the plan of doing that, the plan of action of, pasting little strips of paper poems, the way, in those days at least, people used to put up little strips of paper for apartments. It was an unofficial apartment thing. So he would do that with poetry. He'd also cut up a lot of his poetry. He'd cut it up into little bits and then make grobiki, little tiny coffins of his cut up poetry. And he would give people as gifts little coffins of his poetry. We had a whole bunch of them lying around for a while. We gave one to Vera Dunham as a gift. But I suspect you'll hear this from almost anybody that you speak to. He was just a very generous, kind-hearted person who had a finger on the terror that lies just below the surface, the epiphenomenon of the Soviet middle class in those years, 1983, 84, 85, 86, at the very end of the Soviet period, when, on the one hand, he lived a great life. If you go to his house was, like everybody else's, that had tchotchkes and, bric-a-brac and all that other stuff. It was always interesting to me that someone could live such a life, not of ordinariness, but of kind of demographics predictability, the intelligentsia in Moscow, but also have such a surgeon sense of how to cut through that and speak of layers of consciousness to which we have only the most attenuated access in our day-to-day conscious lives, waking lives. And that's why I think he was valuable to me, both as a person and also as an artist, but as a scholar, so to speak, even though he was not a scholar, but as an analyst of culture. Um, yeah, I miss him a lot. I miss him a lot. So I would say that there were three reactions. Number one, those who knew him, often the Russian emigre or Soviet emigre groups, adored him, and he was in many ways a cult figure. They got who he was. They came already. So there was that group, and they were fun, except that they tended to laugh too loudly and they'd wreck it for everybody else, because it really is like a form of, if not worship, then meditation. The trick is to just listen to what he's doing. Right? And there are people laughing, guffawing. It wrecks the experience for me. Not that everyone was like that, but there was that group that already knew who he was. Then there was a second group of Americans who urged to come would come, but they just didn't get it. In part because Americans are not used to speaking. It's not double speak, but it's like parallel culture has parallel speech. So he would be talking as the milizioner, as the policeman, very sincerely to them and authentically to them. And they wouldn't get it. They wouldn't believe that you could be this way. They kept looking for a signal, like a wink or a nod or something that would give it away. And not getting the giveaway, they couldn't. After a while, the portcullis would come down and they would lose interest because they just couldn't get it. And then there were those people, I think that all over the world that have the capacity to see that there's something going on below the surface and just be very still and keep listening. And then little by little, they would get that this is not a dissident, and this is not, a counter culture figure in the normal sense. But this is somebody who's, in a sense, channeling consciousness for us. He's more a kind of ventriloquist of our implicit ideas, and he brings them to the surface and makes them clear to us by the way he exhorts us to do this or that. And if you can be still enough to connect with him, the smarter Americans, that is to say Anglos, English-speaking people, could figure out what he was up to, not as a protest, as a dissident, but as somebody who literally was parallel to our conscious waking experience of reality. And because that was deeply gratifying. That was the best audience, But that took a while. It took a while for them to tune in, to be able to see him channel that consciousness and to allow themselves to channel it parallel to him.